Okay, Chodesh Tov, everybody. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to see you. First, thank you to the SCA, to Amy and Julie for organizing this fantastic lunch, and also to Elisa Shama for thinking of this fantastic idea. All right, it's really great to see you. And I'd like to talk about Megillat Esther, right? We're starting Adar, and this is perfect to get into the mood. So everybody knows one thing about Megillat Esther. What's missing? Hashem's name. Okay, now this is actually not unique. There's another book of the Tanakh that also does not have Hashem's name in it. Which one? Shir HaShirim. Okay, the winner. You get extra dessert. Good. So now there's obviously a good answer for it, right? For Shir HaShirim is all about a relationship between Bnei Israel and the Kadosh Baruch Hu. There is one opinion in the Gemara that thought that Shir HaShirim, wait a second, that looks like just a love poem. Are you sure that should be in Tanakh? Right? And there was a debate in the Talmud whether Shir HaShirim belongs because, right, it doesn't have God's name in it. But in the end, they said, no, you have to read it as an allegory. The man and the woman, the beloved, are Bnei Israel and Hashem. So why is God's name not in it? Because it's an allegory. And, right, the allegory would break down if you put Hashem's name in it. And furthermore, I think we can understand it as absence makes the heart grow fonder. It's all about a story of a beloved knocking on the door, and then she gets up, and then he's gone, and she's looking for him. And so, right, the friends are looking for each other and can't find each other. They're playing hide and seek. One's being coy, and when one's present, the other is not. And so as we read Shir HaShirim, I think we have the same experience. We're looking for Hashem's name. Wait, it's not here, it's not there, right? Where is Hashem? And that makes our emotional connection all the stronger, our own love, looking for Hashem's name in a book where He's absent. And that helps us to find Him. Okay, and
Because we distance ourselves from Him too.
Okay, good. Right. Sometimes when you distance yourself, that's especially when you feel the absence, and then you want to come closer. Okay, so let's think about Megillat Esther. And I think the standard answer that you all know is a good answer. Why is Hashem's name missing from Megillat Esther? Hester Panim. This is a story about Bnei Israel in exile. And when we're living in exile, Hashem is part of the punishment. Hashem hides His face. And then we are subject to the whims of the nations and randomness. Of course, Hashem is always there. Hester Panim, behind the scenes. But we're not going to experience open miracles like we did in the times of the Exodus. But we have to look more carefully at Hashem's helping hand in the middle of the story when Chashvarosh wakes up in the middle of the night and his dream, right? And so we have to find it more subtly. And so this being a story in exile, and I think that's reflects our experience. That's probably why Megillat Esther is so beloved today, because we have the state of Israel. I think maybe you can call that an open miracle, right? But outside of Israel, sometimes you never know what's going to happen, and we have to have faith that Hashem is with us behind the scenes. All right, I think that's a beautiful answer, and it works. It matches up with the story of Yosef, a lot of parallels between Esther and Yosef. And in the entire section about Yosef, from chapter 37 to 46 in Bereshit, there's no dialogue between Hashem and any character, right? And so people point to that as another parallel where Yosef is in Egypt, he's in exile, and he has to fend for himself, he has to figure out how to rise to power in order to use that power to help out his brothers and help out the future of the nation. All right. All that we know and is a good answer, but I have a different question, which is, how come the characters in Megillat Esther don't seem to be following religion very much? How come Esther herself doesn't pray? I understand why Hashem's name is absent from the narrator, saying it doesn't say Hashem came in and He did this because it's hidden. But how come the heroes of the story, right, don't have Hashem's name on their lips? What? She told them to fast. Okay, so I want to start with that, and that's the first source on the sheet. Esther, when she realizes what's going on, she sent a message to Mordechai and says, Lech kenos kol haYehudim hamnimsaim b'Shushan v'sumu alai v'al tochelu v'al tishtu sheloshet yamim. Fast for 3 days, and I will also, and then I'll come to the king, and if I'm to perish, I will perish. I want to argue, yeah, they're fasting, but it doesn't say that they are praying. And maybe you'll say, well, isn't it obvious? If they're fasting, aren't they praying? I don't think it's obvious, and I'll prove it to you. Every other time in the Tanakh where it says someone was in great distress and he fasted or she fasted, it also says that they prayed. For example, in Yonah, source number 2, Yonah comes and he says, and the people respond immediately. Everyone is fasting and wearing sackcloth, and even it goes up to the king. He makes a decree: everybody should fast. And then they said, Pasuk Chet, Vayikre'u el Elohim bechozka, and they all prayed to Hashem with great strength. So they fast and they join together and they say with prayer, Mi yodeya yashuv v'nicham ha-Elohim. Mi yodeya reminds us of a line in Esther, but they're saying, but here the Mi yodeya has an addressee. Maybe Elohim will change his mind and won't destroy us. So they mention God's name, and this is the city of Nineveh and the king of Nineveh. They are praying. Source number 3, David, Vayivakesh David et Elohim ba'ad Hanad vayasum David som. David is fasting for his son and he's praying. In Ezra, Nasuma v'nevakesha me'Elohenu. They're fasting and they're praying. Nehemiah, vayashavti va'evke va'et abela yamim v'hi sam u'mitpalel lifnei Elohei shamayim. Every other time it says that they fasted and prayed. So this is kind of a glaring absence that they're only fasting. Now, I don't know, maybe she did pray, but the narrator's not telling us that. Or maybe she's mourning. When someone's in distress, even if they're not particularly religious, they might fast and wear mourning clothes because they feel depressed. But it doesn't say that she prayed. And the idea is, yes.
No, I wanted to ask, did Mordechai pray? And you would assume as a man, I'm old-fashioned, that he would be the one to pray, and he tutored her somehow. He raised her, so he would have been an example.
Good, fantastic question. Is there anywhere in the Megillat Esther that Mordechai prays? No, there isn't. Okay, all right, you'd expect it to be. And even in a place where you'd really expect someone to mention Hashem, and that's exactly Mordechai, source number 6, Mordechai tells Esther, Iki im hacharesh tacharishi ba'et hazot, revach v'atzala yamod laYehudim mimakom acher. Esther, if you keep silent, deliverance will come from a different place. What do you mean a different place? I mean, any of us, if we were speaking, would say, Hashem will take care of us one way or another. You'd expect Mordechai. What is makom acher? Happens to be makom. In later Rabbinic Hebrew is a name for Hashem, but not in Tanakh yet. So maybe it's a kind of very hidden reference. But here, exactly where we'd expect to say Hashem's name, it's gone. It's absent. All right. And that's for Mordechai, the hero of the story. So how can we explain this? I want to add more to the question, which is some of the actions of let's say Esther in particular. I'll tell you a story. My son is applied for an internship at CERN, the particle collider in Geneva. He wants to go there for 6 weeks in the summer. So it sounds like a great opportunity. What's my first question? Right. Where are you going to pray? Or where are you getting kosher food? What are you doing on Shabbat? Right. You have to explain to me how you're set up, and then I'll think about you going. Right. So obviously we're concerned about this. Can we ask the same questions to Esther? Okay. You're going to go on this beauty pageant, and is she trying to win? No. How do you know she's not trying to win?
She didn't ask for anything extra.
She didn't ask for anything extra. Okay. Why did she enter in the first place? She has to. She's taken. Oh, she's against her will. So I wonder if she could have been mopey and maybe kind of lost on purpose. I don't know. I'm not sure. But anyway, the questions are, okay, now that you won and you're with the king, is she keeping kosher? Okay, good. The contrast is to Daniel. Daniel is in a foreign king, of course, king, and it says explicitly he had only grains. He had vegetarian meals. It doesn't say that about Esther. Daniel revealed his identity. She does not reveal her identity. So how are they going? Shabbat. They're all going on an outing on Shabbat. Is she going to be sick every Saturday and not go with them? Okay. And how about? Good. So I'm going to get to that midrash, right? It's not in the Pisukim, but that's an important midrash that's going to answer this question.
And she had her own kitchen.
She had her own kitchen. Okay, maybe. All right. So we can, right? The text doesn't say.
Well, she prepared dinners for them, so.
She's all right. And how about the biggest one? She's sleeping with the king. I don't. Okay. Especially if that makes it even worse if she's married to Mordechai. How assimilated? Exactly. Okay, this is going to be.
Esther's a Persian name.
Esther's a Persian name. Ishtar. It's a good name. It's my wife's name too, right? And my grandmother. But it is nowadays. It's a Jewish name, but back then it's the name of a Babylonian goddess. Mordechai also is Marduk is the head of the Babylonian pantheon. Not very Jewish names. What's going on in this story? All right, this is what we have to try to figure out. And I want to propose 3 different approaches that different Jewish communities have given to this, the answers that they've given to this question. You're not going to like the first 2. But I'm setting you up for the 3rd one that I hope you will like. All right, so response number 1 is to say, you know what? We need to reject Megillat Esther. Megillat Esther was actually very controversial, especially in the beginning when it was first introduced. Not everybody accepted it. You can imagine trying to introduce a new holiday on the calendar, right? Look today, Yom Ha'atzmaut, impossible. Maybe come back in 100, 200 years, we'll see if it's more widely accepted. But it's a difficult thing to add a new holiday. And how about a new book and to say, this is part of Tanakh, right? You can imagine that not everyone's going to agree to this. Okay, the next source is not on your sheet. It's actually the lack of a source. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found copies of every book of Tanakh. Everybody know about the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? In the caves, amazing finds in the 11 caves, starting in 1947. We found just the oldest copies of the books of Tanakh. All but one. Which one's missing? Megillat says, not one copy, not even a little bit of one copy. It was hidden. Right, we're still looking. They are still out looking for more caves and looking for more things. So maybe we'll find it one day. It is relatively short, and so it could be an extra hungry worm ate the last bit of it in one of the caves. But most people think that they didn't have it because they didn't believe in it. They probably also didn't celebrate Purim. I'm talking about the Dead Sea sect. This is a bunch of heretics, so we don't have to worry about them. But in their calendar, they had a solar calendar, Purim would fall out on Shabbat. It's not likely they would celebrate any holiday on Shabbat.
One question.
Yes.
Who wrote the book of Esther and when?
Great question. I don't want to deal with that now. Okay. It is a great question. Now, okay, so that's the Dead Sea sect. They didn't accept it. So not all Jewish communities accepted the book. And now I want to show you, even among Chazal, there were some sages that thought Esther should be on a lower level, not quite the same as all the others. And we see this reflected in the following Talmud, in Talmud Bavli Megillah 7a. Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda relates a conversation. Esther sent a message to the Chachamim and said, Kava'uni ledorot, commemorate me for future generations. This could be referring either to the holiday, right? Put me on the calendar, or to the book of Esther. According to this, it's her book, right? So Esther, Mordechai, whoever wrote it, she said, please put this in the canon, right? Make this book part of the Tanakh. And what did they answer to her? Not a good idea. You're going to incite ill will and jealousy of the nations among us. Right? We're going to start celebrating this in public. How's that going to go down? It reminds me of November 30th, 1947, in Syria and Muslim countries. Right? The Jews could not celebrate the rise of the future rise of the state of Israel in public. In fact, whenever there were rallies against Israel, the Jews had to join the rallies against Israel and chant against Israel. Not because they believed it, obviously, but they didn't want their neighbors to say, "Oh, look, a Zionist," and they would get in trouble. And so you can imagine the rabbis saying, we're living in exile, we're going to make a whole holiday about how the Jews took revenge and killed their neighbors. This is not going to look well. Imagine there's a few thousand Jews in Iran now, right? So I don't know what they do. I have to ask them, right? They celebrate Purim, down with the Iranian king. So this could be dangerous, the rabbis are saying, right? Stay low. Right? Maybe you make a little celebration in your house, but don't make a public book. So she sent back to them, my story is already in the history books of the Persians. So they already know the story. You're not teaching anything new. If they know it anyway, so we can put it in Tanakh. Okay, so you have it back and forth. And obviously Chazal are writing this hundreds of years later, but they're putting in this conversation their own anxieties about, is this holiday, should it be added? This book, should it be added or not? The next source, I'll just summarize. Esther said to Chachamim, Kitvuni lidorot, write down my book for generations. They said, sorry, but Tanakh is full. Katavti lecha shalishim. Pasuk says you should write this 3 times. It's talking about the story of fighting Amalek. We already have it 3 times. It's in Sefer Shemot. It's in Sefer Dvarim. It's in Sefer Melachim about the Shaul and David. And so that's it. We're full of the capacity. We can't add another section. And so she argued back and forth, and finally they found a way. One word that says Basefed that refers to Megillah. So you need authorization to go and just add a book of Tanakh. Okay, so from this already you see that this was controversial. Not everybody wanted to add it. Okay, and there's one rabbi in particular, page 2 on top. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shemuel. Shemuel is a first generation Amorah living in Bavel. He says, Esther ena metamea et hayadayim. The book of Esther does not make your hands impure. I have to explain this law. You know that when we have a Sefer Torah, right, we don't touch it with our bare hands because we want to give it honor. So we use a talit or we use a kerchief not to touch it. So this is actually a halacha back in the times of the Bet HaMikdash when Kohanim were pure, anyone was pure. If they touch a Sefer Torah or any book of Tanakh, their hands become tameh, and if they want to eat terumah, they have to do the tilat yadayim. Okay, and this is to show great respect to the book. So by saying that, it's going to make your hands tameh, so you'll keep away from it. So here where Shemuel says the book of Esther does not make your hands impure, that's saying it's a secular book, right? It's like a regular one of these dictionaries, right? This is not a holy book. This is you can touch it without a kerchief. Basically, Shemuel saying this is not the same status as the other books of Tanakh. Now, the Gemara wonders about this. How about Shemuel himself? Did he celebrate Purim? Obviously. Does Shemuel think that this Megillat Esther is not composed under divine inspiration? Shemuel himself said that it is composed under divine inspiration. So he didn't reject it altogether. The Talmud gives a cryptic answer. This book of Esther was composed to recite, but not to be written. In other words, we'll recite it, maybe by heart. It's a good story. It's Ruach HaKodesh, but you can't officially write it. Maybe you can have a private copy, but you can't write it in the Tanakh. What?
It can change when I do that.
If it's oral? It's possible, but sometimes oral texts are memorized precisely, like the Mishnah, right? Word was memorized for generations without much change. Okay, there's a phenomenon in Tanakh called the Kri Uchtiv. There are some words that are written one way and read a different way, or they're written but not read at all, or they are read but not written. So in a way, the whole Megillat Esther is one big Kri Uchtiv, right? It's a blank space, and you have to read it in here, and you have to say it all by heart. In other words, right, this is not part of Tanakh. Hey, it's a good book, it's a holy book. We'll celebrate Purim, but not the same status, according to Shemuel. One last source in this approach, Levi bar Shemuel. That's Levi, the son of Shemuel, probably the same Amorah. He and a colleague were repairing the mantles of the scrolls. You could see that. The original Sefer Torah had mantles like Ashkenazi and Spanish Portuguese ones. They didn't yet have the hard case. So they're preparing these covers for the different scrolls and in the house of Rav Yehuda. When they got to Megillat Esther, they said, "Ha Megillat Esther la ba'e mitpachat." This one doesn't need a special cover, right? You could just leave it out like that. Meaning, according to, this is Shemuel's son, said, you don't have to treat Megillat Esther with the same respect. It's not an official book of the canon. And Rav Yehuda told them, no, ki afkiruta. This is like maritan, it's like you're treating it with irreverence. So put a cover on it also. We don't want to downgrade it that much. All right, so in sum, the first opinion, which was surely the opinion of the Dead Sea sect, maybe other groups of Jews, never accepted this upon themselves. And even in the Talmud, at least Shemuel, remember his name, we're going to come back to him, thought that Megillat Esther is one step lower. He doesn't say why, here, at least not here, but maybe it has to do with the lack of Hashem's name, the lack of prayer, right? What's going on in this book? It seems more like a secular book than the other holy books of Tanakh.
And yet, I learned that out of all the Chagim in the times of Mashiach, only Purim will be the only holiday that will endure.
Absolutely, and the Talmud Yerushalmi says all the other books of Tanakh will be canceled except for the Chumash and Megillat Esther. Right, and so when you see a statement that's like that, you have to assume there's someone arguing about it, right? Whenever you prop something up so much, it means that you have to and say Megillat Esther. That's the most important book. Another, right? Exactly. So that was the other camp was responding to Shemuel and saying, no, this is the most important one. Okay, exactly. All right, that I think reflects the fact that this was a controversial book. All right, now obviously I told you you're not going to like the first one, because in the first one, well, then, what do we do? Okay, right, it minimizes it. So obviously Chazal, the Jewish tradition, has rejected this and said, no, Megillat Esther is important. It may be the most important, but at least as important as the others. And Purim is one of our favorite holidays. All right, so let's go on to the next one. There's another group of Jews from in the time of the second Bet HaMikdash who wanted to include Megillat Esther, but they noticed the lack of prayer and other things, so they put it back in. Now, you can't change the text of the Hebrew, right? But if you're translating the text, well, every translation is also a commentary. And so I want to show you maybe the first translation, the official translation of Megillat Esther into Greek. Okay, this was done by the Jews in Alexandria, who were pious Jews, right, law-abiding, halakha-abiding Jews, but they didn't know so much Hebrew. And so this is like the first art scroll, right, so that they can learn it. We know about it's called the Septuagint, meaning 70. It's also called LXX, right? Roman numerals meaning 70, because of the famous story about the 70 sages that translated. Right, the famous story goes that the 70 sages were put in separate rooms, and miraculously they all came out with the exact same translation. All right, that's one version of the story. There is another version of the story that says that the 70 sages were all in the same room, and they discussed, and that's how they came up with the same one. And now it's right. So that's the famous joke, right? Yes, one thing for them to be in separate rooms, but for 70 rabbis to be in the same room and agree with each other, that's a greater miracle. All right. Now that story is about the Chumash, but after the Chumash, all the rest of the books of Tanakh were also translated. But sometimes the translation is not very literal, right? Art Scroll says up front that they're going to translate according to Rashi, and so they'll add in words to reflect Rashi's translation. If anyone ever saw a Chabad translation, they also translate according to Rashi, but include all the midrashim of Rashi too. And so their translation is very long, right? And these are valid translations. They say up front, we're following this opinion. But if you want a more literal translation, then you'll have to look at, for example, the JPS translation. So what I'm going to show you now is 3 examples of, first I have the JPS translation, which is a pretty much literal Hebrew translation of the Hebrew. And under it, is the Septuagint, noted by LXX. Now, this is a translation of the Greek into English. So that way we can compare English to English. NJPS represents the Hebrew, LXX and RSV represents the Greek. Ready? All right, you tell me if these are good translations. The Pasuk says, Esther did not reveal her kindred or her people, as Mordechai had instructed her. For Esther obeyed Mordechai's bidding, as she had done when she was under his tutelage. Good, we know that Pasuk. Here's the translation. Esther had not disclosed her country. Such were the instructions of Mordechai, but she was to fear God and keep his laws, just as she has done when we was with him. Esther did not change her mode of life. Notice anything different? Okay, so if you're asking, how come Megillat Esther doesn't mention God? In this version, it does. Not only that, but it's anticipating our question. Wait a second, if she's hiding her identity, is she keeping the laws? Yes, she's keeping all the halachot, just as she learned under Mordechai. Okay, so this is not quite a literal translation. You might call it a translation, translated and improved. Anybody know Yiddish here? Yes. So there's a famous Yiddish translation of Shakespeare, and of King Lear, and on the title page it says "Verstehst und verbesser," right? Translated and improved. Okay, so I think that was a joke there, right? But this is what the Septuagint does. Obviously, the pasuk means that she kept everything. Okay, another example. His advisors, Haman's, and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordechai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish stock, you will not overcome him. You will fall before him to your ruin. Right? This is after Mordechai wakes up in the middle of the night and they meet, before they meet. Okay. Now, in the Septuagint translation, it says, his friends and his wife said to him, if Mordechai is of the Jewish people, and you have begun to be humiliated before him, you will surely fall. You will not be able to defend yourself because the living God is with him. And here it's Zeresh, right? The evil wife of Haman. She talks about Hashem and saying, "Oh, Hashem is in charge." So yeah, not only right did Mordechai and Esther talk about Hashem, even Zeresh recognizes his power. One more example. At the end of the Megillah, says many of the people of the land says mit yahadim. It's a reflexive verb, mit yahadim. So the simple meaning is profess to be Jews. They wanted to ally with the Jews because they were scared that they were going to be mixed up with the bad guys and therefore be killed by the Jews. For the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Septuagint says many of the Gentiles were circumcised and became Jews. Mit yahadim to mean they converted. Through Brit Milah, out of fear of the Jews. Okay, so these are all ways of adding halacha, ritual, fear of God into the text. And if you read it that way, oh, fantastic, right? If you don't know the Hebrew. All right, a little bit more about the Septuagint translation. And that is besides these small insertions of a few words here and there, in the Greek version, it actually adds 6 whole new paragraphs. You know, like when you get the DVD of a movie, they have some extra scenes that didn't make the cut. So these are scenes. Obviously, these are not original. They're not in any Hebrew version. But the translator said, we should put these in. The first one is a dream that Mordechai had at the very beginning of the story. The second one is Haman's royal edict. It says he wrote an edict. What was the edict? Wouldn't you like to read it? Well, somebody wrote it and you can read it. The third one is the prayers of Mordechai and Esther. A whole composition of a prayer. So someone was wondering our question, says, oh, yes, she prayed. And, right, this is, by the way, a great school exercise, right? If you were Esther about to go into the king, what would you say, right? Write a prayer from her perspective. So I'm going to read that. We'll read it together in a couple of minutes. Mordechai's royal edict, and then the interpretation of Mordechai's dream. So 6 editions. You notice something about the editions, they're in chiastic structure. The first and last are about Mordechai's dream. The second to last are royal edicts, and the middle are the prayers of Mordechai and Esther before she goes into the king, and then the scene of her actually appearing before the king. Okay, with that in mind, I want to do a little tangent of the structure of the entire Megillat Esther. So this is not to answer our question, just because you have to see this. If you haven't yet, yes.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
I don't remember Mordechai, it ever being written that Mordechai had a dream in the beginning.
It's not there, right? It's not in the Hebrew version.
In the Greek,
Yeah, this is the improved version. Right, they added it in. This edition actually makes it more dramatic in a way, right, by having a dream scene. Yosef has lots of dreams, but in Greek novels and plays, they love these kinds of dreams and dramatizing. So in a way, I know it's kind of funny, to make it more religious, they're also dramatizing it in a way that is reminiscent of Greek plays. Okay.
The dramatized version.
Right. Well, the truth is, if you're going to put a play on, then you have to fill in a whole bunch of gaps and figure out how to do that. So maybe that's what they had in mind. All right. So the next, top of page 3, you can see that the entire Megillat Esther fits into a beautiful chiastic structure, A, B, C, all the way back to CBA. So let's look at the first and last. It starts off describing Achashverosh's kingdom, and it ends describing Achashverosh's kingdom with Mordechai in charge, better and improved. The second scene is the 2 feasts, one for all the provinces for 180 days, and another special one, an extra days for Shushan. Well, at the end of the Megillah, we also have 2 feasts for the Jews, one for those of all the provinces on the 14th of Adar, and another one for Shushan on the 15th of Adar. Right? So those are parallel. In C, Esther appears before the king and is chosen as queen. In little c, Esther comes before the king to request an additional day in battle. So here both meetings between the king and Esther. In D, a description of Haman's stature says Gidal et Haman vayinase'ehu, and advanced him. Haman got a promotion. In little d, a description of the stature of the Jews and Mordechai. And the people were Menaseim, the Jews, favoring the Jews, and Mordechai was Gadol, and he got a promotion, right? So the opposite side of the coin. In E, the casting of lots, there's going to be a war on the 13th of Adar. In little e is the description of the actual war on the 13th of Adar, except that it's the opposite. Instead of the Jews being killed, they are able to defend themselves and kill the aggressors. In F, the king gives a ring to Haman, and Haman writes letters, and Mordechai tears his clothes, the Jews fast. In little f, the king gives the ring to Mordechai. Mordechai writes letters, and Mordechai is dressed in royal garments instead of tearing his clothes, and not a fast, but rather a feast for the Jews. In G is Esther's first feast when she invites Haman and the king. And little g is Esther's second feast. And I always wonder, why does she have 2 feasts, right? Why have a meeting just to schedule another meeting? I know a lot of people do that nowadays, right? All right, first agenda, when are we going to have our next meeting, right? Jokingly, did she have the first meeting just to fill out the chiasm, right? I think there is a deeper reason. You think so? Which is, in the first meeting, by not revealing what the meeting is about, Achashverosh is curious. What's going on with this meeting? What is she hiding? Why is Haman there? Does Haman have some special relationship? What's he trying to do? And maybe that's why he was up all night, right? And suspicious. So I think that first meeting, not revealing anything, was actually a key strategy. In H, Haman's consultation with his wife and his associates. In that first consultation, his wife says, "Oh, go make a pole and hang Mordechai." And then the second one, after that plan worked, that's when she says, "Oh, you have no chance against Mordechai if he's from the Jews." And in the middle is when the king cannot sleep, and he realizes he has to thank Mordechai for having saved his life. Right? That's the middle of the chiasm, and it's also the turning point of the whole plot. Isn't that amazing? Okay. I think what it shows is the theme of v'nahafochu. Everything that's building up and building tension and everything's going to be terrible, right? In a second, it switches and then everything unfolds in the opposite way. All right. So now now that we know the structure, let's look at the additional scenes from the Greek version. So here's the first one. It tells you the time and place. It says second year of Artaxerxes. Again, another tangent. Who is Achashverosh? Who Achashverosh, right? Who is Achashverosh? Most historians think that it's Xerxes, who was the king of Persia around 480. In this version, they think it's Artaxerxes, who was a later king. Okay. Note for later that the Bet HaMikdash was built in the year 516 BCE. So whoever it is, Xerxes or Artaxerxes, are living decades after the Bet HaMikdash is already built. So remember, this whole scene is happening when the Bet HaMikdash is up and running in Yerushalayim, and they're in Shushan. Okay, we're going to come back to that. So thunder, earthquake, tumult. 2 great dragons came forward, ready to fight, and they roared terribly. Any dream interpreters here? Who are the great dragons? Haman and Mordechai. Good. If in case you're not sure, you could look at the last edition, and it says that. And so this is a day of gloom. And then 9, they cried out to God. So in his dream, he sees all this unfolding and how the Jews are going to pray. So already you see that there is prayer here. Why this, even though it becomes more dramatized, you kind of lose the surprise at the end because it gives it away in the dream in the beginning. So I don't really like this edition. All right. Edition C is Mordechai's prayer. Let's read this and let's ask ourselves, the writer of this, whoever it was, what questions was he trying to answer? Like, what was Rashi's question? What was the translator's question? Mordechai prayed to Hashem and calling to remembrance all the works of Hashem, he said, Hashem, you rule as king over all things, for the universe is in your power, and there is no one who can oppose you when it is your will to save Israel. Top of page 4. You know all things, you know that it was not in insolence or pride or of any love of glory that I did this and refused to bow down to this proud Haman. For I would have been willing to kiss the soles of his feet to save Israel. But I did this so that I might not set human glory above the glory of God. And I will not bow to anyone but you, because you are my God, and I will not do these things in pride. So what question do we have about Mordechai's behavior?
Was instigating.
Yeah, Mordechai, how come you didn't bow down, right? Is there any prohibition of bowing to a person?
He had a pesel. Yeah, they said.
Okay, so the rabbis, the Midrash adds, he must have had a pesel on his chest. That's why. But actually, they have to add that to explain why he didn't bow, right? But in simple, if you meet someone, if you're in Japan, right, and you meet someone, so you greet someone by having a little bow, right? This is there's not idolatrous. And so the challenge to Mordechai is, Mordechai, for your personal pride, you're putting the whole Jewish nation in danger, right? Who asked you to do that? Okay. It reminds me of a story that's been going around about that Yoel Gold was telling about Rivka Ravitz. Anyone see it? Mm-hmm. Amazing story. Look up Yoel. Yes, Rivka Ravitz. She, Haredi woman. She became the chief of staff for President Rivlin. And so she had to go with him everywhere he goes and meeting all the prime ministers and kings and presidents. And they had to meet the Pope. And she was supposed to send a message beforehand that she doesn't shake hands with men, but they didn't deliver the message. And she's there, and this is a very important meeting because it's just, international relations. And the Pope goes and shakes Rivlin's hand, and then he puts out his hand to shake Rivka. And now she has her hands behind her back, and he might get insulted and says, what is this? You won't shake my hand. But instead, she explains herself, right? She can't think of it. She can't shake his hand. She can't bow down either because he has a cross, right, on his chest. And so after she explains that she's a very religious, ultra-Orthodox woman, he bows down to her, right, in deference. It's on video. You could see it. And then she meets Biden. And the same thing, Rivlin calls her into the Oval Office. I want you to meet her. And he's shaking hands. She says, no, I don't shake hands. And she explains, from ultra-Orthodox, I have 12 children. And he says, 12 children? My mother would have loved you. She loved big families. And he knelt down on a knee to honor her, right? So amazing story, right? That if you're proud of your identity, and then other people will respect you as well. Okay, so that's a good story. But back to Mordechai, right? He was not as kind as the people that Rivka met, and you could have predicted that he would have taken this personally. And so, is this a good idea not to bow? So, in his prayer, it answers this question: Hashem, I did it for your sake, for your glory, because I represent the Jewish people. I represent you, and that would be a chilul Hashem. Okay, good. Now Esther's prayer. Now let's look for answers to our questions about Esther's behavior. 14. All Israel cried out mightily, for their death was before their eyes. Queen Esther, seized with deadly anxiety, fled to Hashem. She took off her splendid apparel and put on garments of distress and mourning. And instead of costly perfume, she put on ashes on her head. She was utterly humbled, and she prayed and said, 16, ever since I was born, I have heard in the tribe of my family, that you, Hashem, took Israel out of the nations, and you promised them that you will save. And now we have sinned, right? Sounds like she's explaining the theodicy. This is a punishment. 26. You have knowledge of all things, and you know that I hate the splendor of the wicked and abhor the bed of the uncircumcised and of any alien. You know my necessity, that I abhor the sign of my proud position which is upon my head on days when I appear in public. I abhor like a filthy rag. I do not wear it on days when I am at leisure. And your servant has not eaten at Haman's table, and I have not honored the king's feast or drunk the wine of libations. Your servant has no joy since I got here. Right? So what is it? What do we see? She's keeping kosher, right? She never had one, not even yayin nesech. And you might think that maybe she enjoys being queen, right? Maybe this is a lap of luxury, right? And she likes all the glory and the fancy clothes. She says, no, I hate it. I never wear it when I don't have to. And I hate that I have to be with him, right? And I'm forced to. But she's explaining away her behavior. Hashem, don't punish me on account of the things that I have to do. I'm doing everything that I can.
I don't know, this is not real. This is something that the Greeks, whoever it is, made up. This might have been said.
Exactly, right. This is all made up. It's not in the Hebrew. I'm just showing you that in order to make the book holy, these Jews, these Jews said, we have to add this in, right? Because that's the only way that it will be inspiring, right? If you just read it as is, you might get the mistaken notion that Esther did not pray. So we have to make sure. Oh no, of course she prayed. All right. The next scene is worth reading just because of the drama. It's so she's going in to see the king, and she has the train behind her. And she was radiant, and she went through the doors, and she's before the king, and he is full of his majesty and all terrifying. I'm skipping to 7. Lifting his face, flushed with splendor, he looked at her in fierce anger. The queen faltered and turned pale and faint, and she collapsed on the head of the maid who was in front of her. Then God changed the spirit of the king to gentleness, and Elami sprang from his throne and took her in her arms and says, what is it, Esther? I am your husband. Take courage. You shall not die. And so then he embraced her. He said, speak to me. And she said, and I saw you look like an angel, right? My heart was shaken for fear of your glory. You're wonderful. Your countenance full of grace. And while she was speaking, she fainted and fell again. Okay. So this is great if you're putting on a play, right? The damsel in distress. Maybe the first time she really fainted. The second time, I don't know, she faked it to get his mercy. And then, this is the way she got on his good side. Yes.
I read that there's a medrash saying she was 80 years old and her face was green. Is that so? I mean, have you come across that medrash?
Vashti, maybe. Maybe Vashti was green.
No, I heard
Green.
she was.
Oh, she was green. Okay.
I don't know. I wasn't there.
They say green is beautiful. So.
I love green. It's not easy being
Olive,
green,
not easy being green. That's true.
I think the midrash there is like trying to desexualize the story, right? To me, she's pious when she's doing this all L'Shem Shamayim. There's no
Right.
like this story is more romantic, but
Right.
that midrash is trying to remove any possible.
Right. Okay, good. So let's move into move into some midrashim. Now, the midrashim, of course, don't add words to the Hebrew, right? There's not a translation, but I want to show is that many of the midrashim are taking the same approach as the translation did. All right, and so when they read a pasuk and it doesn't say that he prayed, the midrashim are going to put in, oh, here's where she prayed. Okay, so midrash has that ability, right, through interpretation, to also add in similar scenes. So here we get to 16, and she stood in the inner court of the king's house. And when she reached the chamber of idols, the divine providence left her as she's going through the king's palace. And she said, Eli, Eli, lama azavtani. So did she pray? Yes, and she said Mizmor 22, the Mizmor that we will also recite on Purim. And it goes on and describes her prayer. It also says in the next paragraph, 3 ministering angels were appointed to help her at that moment. One to keep her head erect, one to endow with charm, the third to stretch the golden scepter. And how long was it stretched in different opinions. And so I like this because these angels remind me of the maidens who were helping her out in the Greek version. So what I think you see is that the Greek translators knew some of these midrashim, or they're getting it from the same place, right? One is putting it in translation, one's putting it as an interpretation in midrash, but they have some similar themes. Okay, so far, so good, right? Is she praying? Yes, she is praying. I know it doesn't say it, but isn't it obvious? Here's her prayer, in fact, right? One writes a prayer, the other one points to a Mizmor of Tehillim. Now question, how could she sleep with the king? Is that allowed? Vaha Esther Paresya Havai, especially because this is public. I mean, everybody knows she's married to the king, and you're not allowed, if it's a time of persecution, you have to give up your life, even for to eat non-kosher, even to tie your shoe and look like you're bowing down to an idol. You have to give up your life before you do anything. So Esther should have given up her life before sinning in public in a time of persecution. That's the Talmud's question. Abaye answers, Esther karka olamaita. She was passive, right? So she didn't do anything active, and therefore she didn't violate anything. Or hanat atzman shane. If the persecutor is asking you to do something for his own personal benefit, then it's allowed. Like if during persecution, the persecutor says, make coffee for me on Shabbat. So then you're allowed to violate Shabbat to save your life because it's for his personal benefit. It's not just to make you violate Shabbat. So you see that the rabbis are bothered by it, but they come up with a legal solution to explain why this was permitted. Okay, what about Shabbat and Kashrut, the famous Midrash? The Pasuk says that she had 7 maidens to help her out. Why 7? Oh, when the certain one came, she knew that was Shabbat. So that's how she kept the calendar. Okay, what did she eat? Pay attention to this. Vaishaneha ve'etnadot. This is Vaishaneha means they did something different for her. They changed something for her. Maybe in her diet. Rav says, Shechila machal Yehudi. She got Jewish food. She got kosher meals, airplane packages. I don't know how she explained that one to them, but yeah, don't worry, she got it. Shmuel Amar, Shechila Kalde de Chazire. Shmuel says they gave her chines of pork.
What is that?
Bacon. Chine is the back of an animal. They gave her pork. Shmuel says that. Remember what else Shmuel said? Right. Shmuel's the one that said this book is not as holy as the others. So you see that this interpretation goes hand in hand. Because he's reading it and said, well, if she's in the palace, she's eating what everybody else is eating. And therefore, I don't know if she's such a great role model. Okay, we'll read the story. It's good at the end, but I'm gonna touch it with my bare hands, right? Okay, so that's Shmuel. Rabbi Yochanan says, Zir Onim, she got the vegan meal. And as just like Daniel did, right? So the other opinions say, no, she figured out a way to keep kosher. Okay, now about Haman not bowing. So this is the famous Midrash, Oseh atzmo avodat kochavim, right? This evil Haman, he made himself into an idol, or he was wearing an idol, and that's why he was Mordechai was not allowed. So you see that the translators into Greek and the rabbis were both bothered by the same questions, and they both answered them in a similar way. One through translation, one through interpretation, but they're adding in words to the Megillah, interpretation of the Megillah, that are not there in a Peshat reading. So that's all the second approach. I'd like to, how do you like that one? Okay, I mean, there are a lot of midrashim, and we can read it that way, and lots of people read it that way. But let's see, and then why isn't it in the Hebrew already, right? If that's so important, how come there is no prayer? Why do we have to add it in ourselves? So I want to try to propose a theory of why not only God's name is not there, but that there's no prayer or other halachic activities either. And this is somewhat based on Rabbi Menachem Leibtag's reading, to read the Megillah as a holy parody or a veiled criticism of the Jews themselves. And so remember, at that time, the Bet HaMikdash is already standing and is active. Question: when does Esther fast? What date? Pesach, right? We know that because Haman makes the lottery on the 13th of Nisan, says it's the first month, right? And then he sends out the edict, and immediately after she's fasting on the 14th, 15th, and 16th of Nisan. That's Erev Pesach, when in the Bet HaMikdash they're preparing Korban Pesach and Seder night, and even the second Seder night. They didn't have second Seder, right? But so they're fasting on Pesach. Now, what should they be doing on Pesach? And if the Bet HaMikdash is up, where should you be? You should be making Aliyah Laregel, right? Not to mention making Aliyah altogether. If there's a thriving state of Israel and you can just go there and live and, a good economy and everything, and you're still staying behind in Brooklyn, in Shushan, right? Why are you doing that in the first place? Okay, and even if you are, at least go for the holidays. So now you see they're fasting instead of celebrating Pesach. It's a subtle, and I think that's why it doesn't say it explicitly that it was Pesach, but you just just look at the calendar and you see that they're fasting on Pesach. So I think this is on purpose. Now, what else does it tell us about so that's the idea of a veiled criticism, right? Of course, it's a happy story, but the veiled criticism is like, well, what were you doing, putting yourself in danger by remaining in exile? And what are your actions in exile? Is it possible to live fully Jewish when you're in exile, when you're under persecution? You have to hide your identity, right? Is this the ideal, right? If you have to, you have to. But if you don't, then you're really compromising your position. So, okay, here's a few fun things in the Megillah. It also makes fun of the Persians, by the way, right? So the Persians, we know they're known for their bureaucracy. Anytime they make, if you want to do something, you have to go stand on line, to stand on another line, to fill out a form, to get the other form that you have to fill out. And then stand, like the DMV, like Israel, right? I remember when I lived in Israel for a year, we had a car, and you had to get a stamp on a paper. Just, it takes 1 second. We went to the office, and there's everybody there. They're doing nothing. There's nobody there, but it's their lunch break. And they're sitting and talking. So I had to wait in the waiting room for an hour so that they finished lunch break so they could stamp the paper. Okay. Israel's wonderful, though. And, okay, so the Persians were known for their bureaucracy. And you see that their Megillah is making fun of them in 3 places. This is Vashitiya Kadat and Ones. In the party of Shushan, which, by the way, the party in Shushan is a kind of a opposite parallel. You're partying in Shushan with the king instead of making Korban Pesach in Yerushalayim. There's 2 places that are called Habira in all of Tanakh: Yerushalayim Habira and Shushan Habira. Right? So you got the wrong bira. Okay. Now, there's a rule in the drinking party of Achashverosh. The rule was no restrictions. Now, if there's no rules, do you have to make a rule that there's no restrictions about what you can drink? Right? So this is just making fun of it. The Melech tells the Chachamim, Yodei Etim ki chen devar HaMelech lifnei kol yodei dat vadin. He consulted with the sages because the royal practice is you have to ask all the people that are experts. Okay, so they have experts and they're asking. And then it says whatever the king writes in his name and seals cannot be revoked. This emphasis on law and adherence to the law of the Persians, does that make us think about what about adherence of the law for the Jews, right? The Persians are like they're OCD about their bureaucracy and following the law, so we're making fun of them. But are the Jews following their own Jewish law as well when they're in Persia. Okay, it's a little subtle, but I think it's there. Now, this making fun of the Persians is funny, and the Megillat Esther is not the only one that does this. Herodotus is a Greek writer, a Greek historian. He's called the father of history, and he writes about the Persians and describes them as follows. Source 23. The Persians are accustomed to deliberating on the most serious business while they are drunk, and whatever decision they reach in these sessions is proposed to them again the next day by the host whose house they had deliberated the night before. Then, if the decision still pleases them when they are sober, they act on it. If not, they give it up. Conversely, whatever provisional decision they consider while sober, they reconsider when they are drunk. Okay, and you see this, like Megillat Esther is exactly making fun of them in the same way. When the Persians happen to meet each other on the street, one can tell whether or not they're equals simply by watching them. For instead of declaring a greeting to each other, they kiss each other. But if one of them is of much lower status, he falls to the ground and prostrates himself before the others. So it's not just like a Japanese greeting, right? This is really showing you are lower. You have to humiliate yourself. Okay, good. So it's nice to have that historical background of what other people thought of the Persians. All right, now a little bit about, we mentioned Esther and Mordechai and their names. The rabbis knew and emphasized that Esther was named after Ishtahar, right? A Babylonian divine name. How about Mordechai? What do we know about his history? Tell me if you can hear a key word. It's a little subtle. Asher hogla mirushalayim hagola asher hogleta miyochanan melech Yehuda asher hegla Nebuchadnezzar melech Bavel. Okay, Mordechai is in exile, and when you say that so many times, you say, well, why are you in exile? Maybe you had to be in the first place, but now exile's over, right? What are you still doing in Bavel, in Persia, with a Greek name? Okay. Furthermore, during this party, and you know these midrashim, they're drinking out of vessels. Which vessels were they drinking out of? The Bet HaMikdash vessels. Now, of course, this is not in the Pshat, right? But this Midrash is saying, well, it sounds very familiar. And they're picking up on a Pshat, because look at the description of the king's palace. Chur, Karpas, Techelet, Argaman, right? All the things in Parashat HaShavua and Parashat Terumah, that the Bet HaMikdash is built with those very same things. And I think the Megillah is going out of its way to describe the king's palace as a anti-parallel to the Bet HaMikdash.
How come they didn't give us Mordechai's Hebrew name? Esther, they told us, was Hadassah. Mordechai, we don't know.
Yeah, right. Great question.
Maybe he didn't have
Maybe he didn't have one. Right. Okay, good. Okay, we're almost done. And this is emphasized in the following Midrash. What was Achashverosh wearing at the party, according to the Midrash? The clothing of the Kohen Gadol, right? And so, again, not the Peshat, but the Midrash is highlighting the subtle references in the Megillah itself to the Bet HaMikdash. Okay, now here's another, maybe a last parallel. Esther cannot go to the king unannounced, right? Why? She'll get killed. Look at source 28. כל עבדי המלך ועם מדינות המלך יודעים כי כל איש ואישה אשר יבוא למלך אל החצר הפנימית. If you go into the inner courtyard, right? There's an outer courtyard, an inner courtyard, an inner, right? Kodesh Kodashim, where the king is, and you can only go there, right, when you're called, otherwise on the pain of death. What does that sound like? The Kohen Gadol going to the Kodesh Kodashim once a year when he's called to pray on behalf of the Jewish people. So there's another exact parallel. Hey, Jews, you decided to stay in exile and put your fate in the hands of this buffoon king, rather than take the opportunity of coming to Israel, and there you could be your own sovereign and be under the protection of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the real king in Kodesh Kodashim. Right? That's your decision. So it's a happy story. Hashem saves us in the end, but the people have to work really hard to do that, right? And this is, like, don't try this at home. Don't do this again, right? If you really want to be saved, come under Hashem's protection. That's going to be in Israel and not remaining in exile. All right, last point. Ish Yehudi. There are two places where it says the word Ish Yehudi in Tanakh. This is source number 30. One is Mordechai, and one is in Zechariah, where it says, in the future, 10 people from all different nations and languages are going to grab on to the corner of a cloak of an Ish Yehudi and say, take us with you to Yerushalayim. Right? That's a Yehudi. What? Exactly. Amazing. I mean, if you go and you see these Christian groups coming to visit Israel and touring, right? You think of this pasuk. All right. And the words shalom ve'emet also come up twice in Tanakh, in Megillat Esther, sending words of shalom and emet to all the rest of the Jews. Now there's peace and now you can live. Zechariah says it also. He says the fast days during the whole year eventually will turn into happy days. Moadim tovim va'emet ve'shalom ehavu, where you will seek truth and peace. Okay. So this is right parallel. The redemption at the end of Megillat Esther is parallel to redemption and return to Yerushalayim. And finally, our custom of matanot levyonim and mishloach manot. Right? What does that have to do with being saved from Haman and Achashverosh? Well, Zechariah is one of my favorite names. That's why I used it for my third son, because we love his prophecy so much. So he says, Zechariah is the prophet living when they're rebuilding the second Bet HaMikdash, right? And in the middle, they come and ask Zechariah, should we still be fasting on Tisha B'Av? Because, look, we have a Bet HaMikdash. And he says, listen, you're asking the wrong question. This is a technical question. Are you taking care of the widow and the orphan? Are you having mercy, ish et achiv? Are you treating each other respectfully? And stop thinking evil and saying bad things about your brethren, right? This is what Hashem wants. He wants you to take care of the poor and the vulnerable and be better friends and stop saying bad things about each other. That is when you deserve the redemption. And so too in Megillat Esther, right? That's the final lesson. What's the best way to celebrate? Yes, by eating and drinking, and we do that in a holy way to fix the sin of the Yehudim in Shushan. But here, another way we're going to commemorate is, we're going to change it for Yagon Simcha Me'ever Liyom Tov Lasot Otam Yemei Mishte V'Simcha U'Mishloach Manot Ish L'Rehu Matanot Evyonim, by increasing our friendship and love for one another and giving gifts to the poor and making them happy and having them join in our celebration. That is what brings the ultimate redemption. And so finally, why is Megillah? Let's answer the question, right? How come there's not only no God's name, but no prayer and Esther? What's going on? We're looking for that. And as we look for those actions, so we say, wait a second, are we doing it? Are we up to par with keeping our identity in exile, which is really hard to do? And well, if it's so hard to do, and sometimes you have to hide, and you have to wear a baseball cap, and you can't be so, always proud of what you're doing, and that compromises your own identity and fulfillment of the laws. So the answer is, don't live in Shushan, right? Let's be able to celebrate next year in Jerusalem. Thank you, everybody.